My angel is sleeping on the couch. Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel for another video. Apologies for this not going up last week. I didn't film it last week. I didn't edit it. I didn't upload it. It didn't exist because big bad endo flare up towards the end of last week, which means we're horizontal. There's no bras going on. There's no brushes going through hair. There's no standing up. There's no leaving the house. So apologies for that, but you will get me twice this week. You'll get today's video and the podcast with Holly probably Thursday or Friday. That'll be an amazing one all about questions relating to, do you really have control when you have an eating disorder? So tune in for our thoughts, our lived experience, and today I'm sharing something lived experience based as well, which is the eating disorder behavior that I was most ashamed of and embarrassed by when I was unwell and even early on in my recovery before I'd unpacked all the reasoning behind why I would do it. It wasn't just an eating disorder driven mechanism. It was also something from my childhood. And I think it's a really shared one and not necessarily one that people talk about because there is a lot of shame and embarrassment. And now that I have a deeper understanding of why it happens, I don't really have that shame and embarrassment anymore. So hopefully it'll open up an avenue to have a conversation about it yourself, or to even recognize it as something to maybe work on. So I had a whole host of very obvious eating disorder behaviors, things that are referred to as overt eating disorder behaviors. And then there's what we call covert eating disorder behaviors. So things which are less easily recognized that could be attributed to something else. They're not necessarily always explained by the presence of an eating disorder or disordered eating. But if there is an eating disorder or disordered eating at play, then it's quite likely some of these things fall into that category as to why they're happening or where they're coming from. And one of my more covert behaviors that I was exceedingly embarrassed by and exceedingly ashamed of and got me into uncomfortable situations over and over and over again, all the way from childhood up until when I recovered, was stealing food. I stole so much food, I think it could probably fill a fridge and a cupboard, if not a couple of them. I didn't shoplift. I didn't steal food from like a shop or a service station or a restaurant or a cafe. That is also something that can happen and equally should not be stigmatized, something you shouldn't be ashamed of or embarrassed by. For me, theft of food more so happened in my home, especially in like housemate situations or roommate situations. And it was so challenging to not do it, because when you are restricting, and restriction can happen in a multitude of ways: restriction by amount of food, restriction by type of food, and restriction as far as like how you talk to yourself about food. So mental restriction, putting limitations or judgments or shame or guilt on yourself for like your food choices, etc. So there's so many different kinds of restriction. All of mine were at play at different times. But living in a share house situation where I didn't have control over what food was available to me, what food was in the fridge, what food was in the cupboard, where it was accessible, like it's physically accessible. It's not necessarily morally or ethically accessible because it's not my property, it's not mine. But when you have a dominant eating disorder, it kind of just focuses on the access to the food, right? All of those layers of like your values and what you think is right and wrong take a major backseat to what your eating disorder wants, needs, expects, demands right in this moment. So I found it really hard to be in share house situations and not steal other people's food. This happened probably across like 3 or 4 different accommodation situations, ranging from, I took it on tour, ranging from all over Sydney, all the way to London. I would take food, steal food from my housemates that were especially in the category of food that I was not allowed to have. So to give some more context to my behavioral pattern, I had anorexia binge purge subtype. So I would go through periods of restriction where I would obviously be restricting certain types of food, certain food groups, and specific foods that were just like the worst of the worst. Absolutely cannot have them, and bad person if I have them, up for a lot of punishment if I have them. And that is not sustainable. That is going to break at some point, and it would break. And I wouldn't have to go to the shops or go to any other location to access the foods that my brain wanted in that moment of like just the dam breaking, and all of my need for making up for that restriction and getting energy in was right there in the cupboard. And that was a biological, physiological, and psychological level of overwhelm that meant that there was absolutely no rationality getting in. There was no checks and balances against, should I do this? Is it right to do this? Will there be consequences? What am I going to do when that person comes home and finds that all this food is gone? This cake is not in the fridge. Their, snacks are out of the cupboard. Like, what are you going to do? There was no pre-planning. It wasn't premeditated or malicious. It was out of total overwhelming need, like you need oxygen. And because I also had the component where I would binge and purge, sometimes the access to that food would then trigger lots and lots of very intense behaviors. And that would then pile onto what we already experience in that behavioral pattern, which is you get through using a behavior, and then what's on the other side of that? Guilt and shame. You already feel so guilty and ashamed of using the behavior in and of itself. And you couple that with the guilt and shame of, I just stole somebody else's property. And probably, like, I wasn't friends with all of my housemates. I definitely didn't mesh with all of them, but I had really good friends who I lived with, and I would take their food too. It wasn't just the ones I didn't like. Not so much didn't like, just didn't like connect with. Everyone was fair game. Everyone was like sort of, gonna have their stuff taken at some point. But that loaded on top of the already innate game and shilt. Slow it down, Mia. You're not on TikTok. You don't have to prove that you're not talking at a millennial pace. The guilt and shame that was already built in would then be compounded with the genuine guilt and shame of, I just took somebody else's food. I took somebody else's property. And then the panic of, when are they going to get home? Can I make it to the shops? Are they going to notice that it's different? Is that then going to start a conversation about where their food went? Or if they do come home before I have a chance to replace it, what conversation is that going to be? There's so many layers to that potentially will stumble across, why are you stealing food? Which then will potentially open the door to bringing attention to my behaviors and my eating disorder, which is more terrifying than anything. And to be clear, like, I replaced all food that I took, but sometimes I wouldn't do it in time. And it did bring on some very uncomfortable conversations. I remember just before I went into recovery, my housemate at the time texted me because all their yogurt was gone. Because sometimes, like, it just didn't matter what the food was. It was just that there was food available. As we know in in whatever your behavioral profile is, very often it's not like, oh, it's just the food that I really am restricting. It's just sometimes whatever food is available. And I was up at the shops and I was replacing the food, and they texted me, and I wanted to crawl into the freezer section and live there, and just having to send back like this huge apology and letting them know that I was replacing it right now, and coming up with some lame excuse that could not be really explained. Like, there was just no logical explanation for like the amount of food in the time that it disappeared. It was just obvious, right? And just the deep shame and embarrassment, just true embarrassment, because I didn't understand why I was doing it. I didn't understand the biological reasons why I was doing it, which all makes so much sense to me now, that you can't live in this extreme place of not eating enough. And as I said earlier, not eating enough falls across a number of categories. It's not just by quantity. That's not sustainable. That pendulum is going to swing, and it's going to swing into that lack of rationality and, trying to get access to as much food as possible. But the psychological reasons why I did it really were not uncovered until I went into therapy. And my childhood came up a lot in therapy. I grew up with a very abusive stepfather, and food was one of the ways that abuse was enacted, I guess. And it was punitive and it was severe. And it's where a lot of my shame and guilt and a lot of my sort of eating disorders DNA was built in, was how I was treated when I ate certain food or wanted certain food or would take certain food. And the punishment wasn't, please don't do that. Like, that's, the parents' food, can you ask? It was like the worst thing you could have done, and very, very Scary, very, very scary. And can you tell how uncomfortable it makes me to talk about this stuff? Which is why I rarely talk about it. It was so much of like the root system of where my eating disorder came from and how I viewed myself. It wasn't just you took that food and that was wrong and that was bad. It was you wanting that food makes you selfish and weak and a bad kid, and we're not going to talk to you for 2 weeks. Even pre-eating disorder, I saw myself in that way. If I wanted certain foods, I felt disgusted with myself. I felt like I was just this thing who had no restraint, no control, and no self, because a big part of it was also like self-respect, like have some self-respect, and just character assassination of like an 8-year-old. And it was once I did that work in therapy that embarrassment and that shame really, really dissipated, because I just felt so bad for that kid version of myself and imagined, I say this often, like go and look at 7 and 8-year-olds in a non-creepy way. Don't just go stare at them in public, but just go and see how like innocent and just little sponges they are, just waiting to get feedback about like, are they good? Are they bad? Are they loved? Are they, you know? And so I would do that and be like, oh God, like this is a kid. And that was me, trying to navigate a really, really complicated household, really, really complicated parenting dynamic. And part of that punishment and that abusive environment was very much communicated through control over food. And again, like character assassination of you. That's why I don't feel ashamed or embarrassed. It's why I can talk about it on the internet. It's why I want to come and talk about this stuff that used to hold so much shame for me, because it's very, very common. It is very, very common, and it makes so much sense from a biological standpoint, but it also could for you make so much sense based on your history, your upbringing, previous experiences. It doesn't have to just be like within your family. It could have been a relationship and how somebody punished you or judged you through food, and these things that we internalize and carry with us and can then form a very, very robust part of your eating disorder root system, which is why it's so important to go and unpack that. And if you can't immediately get to a place of compassion for yourself right now, you might be able to get to that place more easily through how you view this younger version of yourself. You know, we're not very discerning when we're children, because we shouldn't have to be. That should be the role of our parents. We should be able to just be innocent and explore and be curious, and obviously, you know, have boundaries there and guidance for sure. But to be able to go back with fresh eyes and see how inevitable that behavior was, that wasn't because I'm a bad person. It's not because I'm dishonest. So yeah, I find that's a behavior that people are very, very reluctant to explore or admit to or unpack. And I would just really encourage you, if that has been or is a part of how your eating disorder manifests or expresses itself, please know you've got nothing to be ashamed of. There's nothing to be embarrassed about. That's why lived experience input is so important, because it's like, oh yeah, I've done that too, and here's why it might be happening. So I hope that's helpful if it sheds light on something that might be going on for you, or something that you've been reluctant to look at or go into. And yeah, just know that so much of this stuff can be explained, and it's usually not that you're just a terrible person, right? So much love to you guys. I hope that you have a beautiful week ahead. I will see you later in the week with Holly for a Beyond Body podcast episode. In the meantime, as always, much love. Take care. Bye, guys.